Hi, everyone, and welcome to Module 2, The Roaring Twenties. Today we'll be going over some key aspects of 1920s American culture. So typically, why do we refer to the 20s as the Roaring Twenties? Well, it actually comes from all the new sounds during the era. So the sound of jazz, the invention of the car, trolleys for transportation, talking movies or talkies instead of silent films, and the widespread use of the radio. In the 1920s, we have this idea that America has entered into this new prosperous era. The standard of living is higher. People are living longer, eating better. They have leisure time for the first time, so they have some free time. They also have the income to pay for what they want instead of just what they need. So we'll talk about how that gives rise to an American consumerist culture and how we still kind of have that obsession with consumerism today. Another part of 1920s culture is prohibition. So during the 1920s, with the passage of the 18th Amendment, alcohol is prohibited. So prohibition, alcohol prohibited. This is spearheaded by women. So the Women's Christian Temperance Union. So it's a way for women to be more political, they saw was maybe through the religious sector. So women were actually tired of having their husbands come home drunk and beat them. So they started this movement to ban the selling of alcohol as a way to live a safer life with their husbands. So in 1920, the 18th Amendment passes, so that bans the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors. If you know, in this phrasing of the amendment, it doesn't say anything about consuming alcohol. So that'll be important to note. So you see here people looking that a restaurant is no longer going to sell booze or alcohol. Booze hounds, please stay out. So they won't want people illegally consuming alcohol on their premises. But in actuality, prohibition doesn't really do much in terms of changing drinking habits. Actually, data shows that alcohol consumption increased during prohibition. So when it was illegal, kind of like if your parents tell you to not do something, it makes you more inclined to do that thing. So alcohol consumption increases during prohibition. And part of this is because there's a lot of loopholes in the 18th Amendment. So I said consumption was left out, so people stocked up on liquor and just bought a ton before the amendment passed. You could also make homemade wine, beer, and moonshine, which is like homemade liquor as well. And so these would be served in illegal places, which was called a speakeasy, which is an illegal secret bar. How were these able to function during Prohibition? Well, Prohibition was passed, but there's little funding and force behind this change to the Constitution. So it's not like police officers were entering individual people's homes and checking to see if they didn't have any alcohol. So like I said, these speakeasies or secret bars would pop up. So typically in another business, these would be in the back and you needed like a secret password to get in, and a lot of organized crime. And the mafia is created around creating a secret network to distribute alcohol. So that's another aspect of 1920s culture. And again, you see here how this sign says, no intoxicating liquor allowed, but people are mocking this and popping champagne bottles around that. So very few people actually followed Prohibition. We also have this concept of the new woman in the 1920s. So with the 19th Amendment, women gained the right to vote, and they're gaining more independence. after, the conclusion of World War I, and that is reflected in their style. So they're wearing their hair short, which used to just be, a man's haircut would be to have short hair. Skirts are now shorter above the knee. You can see women's legs with sheer stockings, but they still have stockings on. And you'll see the rise of makeup, another consumer product that people become fascinated by. And we have this image of the flapper girl, which some of you may be familiar with because her dresses flap at the bottom. So that's a common image. In terms of the racial dynamic of the 1920s, we're still living in an era of Jim Crow segregation. However, after or during World War I, a lot of men are drafted, and that leaves a lot of vacancies for factory jobs, and we're halting temporarily immigration from other countries. So African Americans see that as an opportunity to flee the very intense Jim Crow South, where there's a lot of racialized violence against African Americans. And so they're going to northern cities to seek out a better life. And this is known as the Great Migration. It's great because a lot of people migrated during this time. So from 1910 to 1930, over 900,000 African Americans are leaving the South. They're seeking more equality in the North. It's not that the North is, fully racially equal, obviously, but they could access their right to vote more easily in northern states and cities. And when the African Americans move out of the South, they're settling in all Black communities, typically in northeastern cities. But we'll take a look as well, depending on where you're coming from, depends on where you would migrate to. So obviously you would migrate to the next closest city. So if you're coming from the East Coast, you would go to an East Coast city, and then the Midwest, or you would go all the way out west to California. So this is going to be our first question in our notes. So if you take a second to pause the video and answer this question that's on your notes. So thinking back to what you know about the Reconstruction era, which ends in 1877, what's one specific law or social practice that would have encouraged African Americans to migrate to northern cities? So what's one of those push factors that would encourage them to move out of the South and to a northern city? So take a second, pause the video, and answer that question. Okay, great. So when people move to northern cities and settle, one example is they settle in Harlem, which is a neighborhood in New York City. And so at this time, 1 in 9 people in New York City are Black. So Harlem is a very populated area full of African Americans. And you have the Renaissance or rebirth in Harlem, where a lot of people there get involved with art. So writing, poetry, dance, visual arts, and they use that as a tool to promote African American cultural achievements. So the goal is that if you make art that people value, in turn, they will value the artist. So if someone reads a book by Zora Neale Hurston, who's a Black author, if white people read that, they would start to value her and other Black people for the art that they could produce. So it's a way, an avenue towards achieving equality. Another sort of iteration of that is the jazz age. So jazz is an invention, which is weird to think of that as an invention, but it's created in New Orleans by Black people. And so you would play jazz in a jazz club, you'd have musicians and dancers, and typically jazz clubs would have, it would be segregated. So white people would come in the earlier hours of the evening, and in the later hours of the evening, they would leave, and then the Black people who lived in the neighborhood would come to the clubs. So it's just kind of odd that white people would go to be entertained by Black people, but wouldn't choose to stay and, have an integrated club experience. And you might note some of these famous musicians. You might have heard their names before. So a lot of famous musicians come from this jazz age. So you see here's some of these jazz clubs. The Cotton Club is in New York City, still there. So here we have another opportunity for you to pause the video and answer another question on your notes. So how do you think promoting Black art and artists would help to improve racial equality? So take a minute to pause the video and answer that question on your notes. And I also spoke about, right, how we have a rise in consumerism in American culture. So in the 1920s, the nation's wealth increases. So we're in this post-war prosperity after World War I. And with more time, or with more money, comes more freedom. So freedom to buy things, but also freedom with time. So we see this rise in consumerism, or buying goods, consuming goods. And part of this is the rise of advertising in things like magazines and newspapers. So we have these inventions of new consumer goods, toilets, cameras, watches, etc. And people become obsessed with their extra wealth with buying things. They see ads and they're enticed to buy things. And then we start to compare ourselves to others and judge value based on how much stuff you have. So you can see from these ads that there's a promotion of consumerism, that you can afford something. And, it's using enticing language to draw people in to want to buy stuff. You might recognize L'Oreal from that. And again, right, trying to entice people to buy things, and you're going to start to judge people's value based on how much stuff you have. So you would compare, if your neighbor has a car and a vacuum and a toilet, wow, they must have really made it. I want those things too. So what is an example of consumerist culture in America today? So again, if you can pause the video here and answer that question on your notes. We also have in the 1920s the rise of movies and radio. So movies were our main source of entertainment in the 20s. 80 million people on average go to the movies each week. We also use the radio as a form of communication and entertainment. So it's a way to advertise for things. You'd also have radio shows. You could listen to baseball games on the radio, have over 800 stations. Most Americans had a radio by the mid-30s, and it's a way to communicate with the American people as well as entertain. So you see here we have a national radio broadcast by the president. So the radio could be used to communicate with the American people. So you see a family gathered around here to listen to their radio and shows. We also have in the 1920s the invention of, or the rise in popularity of baseball. So baseball is invented in the 1870s in America, but it becomes more popular in the 20s because more people have access to it to listen to the games on the radio. So we have professional leagues, but baseball was segregated. And if you recognize Babe Ruth as a famous baseball player from this time. All right, so that concludes the end of our 1920s lecture. Thank you so much, and good luck on your assignment.